Hi guys. It is a busy week for me. I am recording a sermon that a lot of people have trouble with. The Exodus is a story that we oftentimes hear and we disconnect it from the rest of the goings on in the story. But it connects then with the death of Egypt's firstborn, and that for a lot of people is a text that a lot of people have trouble with. One of the things that when you look at scripture, there are things in there that are sometimes hard to hear. So today we're going to look at the story of the Passover, and we're also going to think about what to do when you have a story in scripture that makes you uncomfortable. So as you hear the story of the Passover, I want you to keep both of those things in mind. What is the good news in this story? But also, what do you do when a scripture makes you uncomfortable? So let's go ahead and get started. This is Exodus chapter 12, and I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 12, verse 1 through Exodus 32. So it's a fairly long reading. Hear the word of God. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month will be the first month. It will be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole Israelite community, on the 10th day of the first month, they must take a lamb from each household, a lamb per house. If the household is too small for a lamb, it should share one with a neighbor nearby. You should divide the lamb in proportion to the number of people who will be eating it. Your lamb should be flawless, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You should keep close watch over it until the 14th day of the month. At twilight on that day, the whole assembled Israelite community should slaughter their lambs. They should take some of the blood and smear it on the 2 doorposts and on the beam over the door of their houses in which they are eating. The same night they should eat the meat roasted over fire. They should eat it along with the unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Don't eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it over the fire with the head, the legs, and the internal organs. Don't let any of it remain until morning, and burn any of it left over in the morning. This is how you should eat it. You should be dressed with your sandals on your feet and your walking stick in your hand. You should eat the meal in a hurry. It is the Passover of the Lord. I will pass over the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every oldest child in the land, both humans and animals. I will impose judgment on the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be your sign on the houses where you live. Wherever I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day will be a day of remembering for you. You will observe it as a festival to the Lord. You will observe it in every generation as a regulation for all time. You will eat unleavened bread for 7 days. On the first day you must remove the yeast from your houses, because anyone who eats leavened bread during that time, during those 7 days, will be cut off from Israel. The first day and the 7th day will be a holy occasion for you. No work at all should be done on those days, except for preparing the food that everyone is going to eat. That is the only work you may do. You should observe the festival of unleavened bread, because on that precise day I brought you out of the land of Egypt in military formation. You should observe this day in every generation as a regulation for all time. It is in the first month, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day, you should eat unleavened bread. For 7 days no yeast should be found in your houses, because whoever eats leavened bread will be cut off from the Israelite community. Whether the person is an immigrant or a native of the land, you should not eat anything made with yeast in all your settlements. You should eat only unleavened bread. Then Moses called together all the Israelite elders and said to them, "Go pick out one of the flock for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it into the blood that is in a bowl and touch it to the beam above your door and to the 2 doorposts with the blood in the bowl. None of you should go out of the door on your house until morning. When the Lord comes by to strike down the Egyptians and sees the blood on the beam above the door on the doorpost, the Lord will pass over that door. He won't let the destroyer enter your houses to strike you down. You should observe this ritual as a regulation for all time, for you and your children, when you enter the land of the Lord that the Lord your God has promised you. Be sure to observe this ritual. And when your children ask you, "What does this ritual mean to you?" you will say, "It is the Passover sacrifice to your Lord. For the Lord passed over the houses of Israelites in Egypt, when he struck down the Egyptians and spared their houses." The people bowed down and worshipped. The Israelites went and did exactly what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron to do. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the first offspring in the land of Egypt, from the oldest child of Pharaoh down to those sitting on his throne to the oldest child of the prisoner in jail, and all the firstborn offspring of the animals. When Pharaoh, all his officials, and all the Egyptians got up that night, a terrible cry of agony rang out across Egypt, because every house had someone in it who had died. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron that night and said, "Get up, get away from you, both you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you said. You can even take your flocks and herds as you asked. Just go and bring a blessing on me as well." May the Lord bless the reading and the hearing of this God's holy word. Amen. The Exodus is one of the key stories in Scripture. As a child, I remember hearing that first part of the story where it talked about God passing over the people, but we never really talked about what happened to the Egyptians. Then I could stay up and watch the entire Ten Commandments movie. And I remember the images of parents weeping over their dead child's body. And that made no sense to my 12-year-old brain. What did that have to do with the Passover? I eventually read all of the book of Exodus and got the story. And I didn't like the explanation. I'm still not entirely comfortable with it. Why would God punish all those little children? Our minds don't wrap around that easily. So depending on your theological bent, we come up with one explanation or another to let God off the hook for murder. Some people will tell you that the event never really happened. After all, there is no archaeological evidence that the event ever happened. And no, there isn't. There will be people who try to tell you that there is, but there isn't. Some people will argue that the people living in exile in Babylon wrote this story down over 2,000 years after the events would have had to have taken place if they actually had happened, so they're just making stuff up. And that's true. The Exodus stories in the book of Exodus reach their final form during the exile, which takes place almost 2,000 years after the time in which the Exodus would have had to have happened if it actually happened. What they miss is that there are older texts in the Bible that talk about the Exodus. One of them is embedded in the book of Exodus. It's Exodus chapter 15. It's probably the oldest bit of actual Hebrew scripture we actually have. Exodus 15 is dated probably to the time of King David, at least. It may be older than that. The words in it are very old Hebrew. The form of the language is some of the oldest we have, and there are hints that it comes down to that time period from an older time period in the way the language is structured. It may have actually been, when it says it's written by Moses, actually have been written by Moses and Miriam. In addition, there are several Psalms from the time of David and Solomon that can reliably be dated to that time that mention the Exodus and Exodus events. So the Exodus lived in Jewish memory prior to the exile. So we can't blame this on people living in Babylon and making up stories to make themselves feel better. Other people will seek to come up with naturalistic explanations for the events themselves. The most convincing one of those arguments lies in the events of a volcanic explosion causing a catastrophic inversion of a lake at the headwaters of the Blue Nile. It requires a rearranging of the order of the plagues that would fit what happened in the sequence of the events. We actually know that this has happened in Africa, in other areas on the Nile River headwaters in the 20th century. We actually saw it happen. And it ended up actually with the death of the firstborn in that particular part of the Nile. And it happened for a very simple reason. Only the firstborn children in poor families had enough money to have them up on a raised bed. And they were the only ones at the level who were able to be killed by carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide poisoning. The children that were poor, the children of these poor families after the firstborn slept on the floor and were therefore below the level of the poisoning in these houses. And so they were spared from the poisoning. But I'm not sure this is really much of a better explanation. If God is in charge of nature, at best this downgrades the charge to manslaughter or negligent homicide from murder 1. And by the way, our problem with this text is not new. Paul, Jesus, Peter, Stephen, and a host of rabbis, Muslim scholars, and a bunch of other people who have been writing long before the modern era talk about the liberation of the Jews from Egypt without ever mentioning the Egyptian suffering because nobody knows what to do with it. I don't have a good answer to the question of why those firstborn boys, and though the text here mentions all the firstborn, more than likely it would have just been the firstborn boys. The best answer I have been able to come up with is that in that culture it would have been the kids that inherited the property, and that would have most of the time been the firstborn boy, because Egypt, like most of the ancient world and even on into the modern world, it was the firstborn boy who got the property when dad died. There might have been an older daughter and she didn't get the property. There might have been other sons and other daughters after the firstborn boy and they didn't get the property. So if there were slaves in the family, it was the firstborn boy who got the property. There were exceptions to that, and you only have to think of Jacob and Joseph and others in Scripture to know that there were exceptions, but it was the firstborn boy, 9 times out of 10, who was going to be the one who had the power over the slaves. So that is probably the best reason for why the firstborn child was singled out, and it was probably, as I said, the firstborn boy. I still don't like the answer. And I'm not required to like it, but I am required to wrestle with it until I learn to understand that this is a hard text from a culture that is very different from ours. There is a bit of good news, a bit of the gospel in this tragedy. And I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to pause and give you a second to think because I can't hear your answer. What is the longest lasting superpower on Earth? What superpower lasted longer than any other throughout all of history? most people usually answer with either the British Empire or the Roman Empire. And those are not bad guesses. The British Empire, just so you know, lasted a little over 400 years. And the Roman one about a millennium. So they're not bad guesses. But Spain beats Rome, beats Britain by 200 years. And China beats Rome by 500 years. However, at a little over 3,000 years, it would take any two of the other ones, possibly three, depending on which two you pick, to equal Egypt. Depending on when we date the Exodus, Egypt was at its zenith of the Middle Kingdom and sliding toward decline. We're just beginning to rise out of a period of occupation, one of only three during its total time of power, toward the rise of its greatest pharaoh ever, Ramses II. And that, by the way, is the one that you'll see in most Hollywood epics. It is usually Ramses II who's picked, though there's some problems with that dating, particularly if you're trying to give the judges their full time span. Pushes David into the wrong time frame. Excuse me, my cat's doing weird things. Egypt, if it is Ramses' date, is the last one standing in a 100-year Cold War. The Assyrian and Nubian empires, the one that had just done a 100-year occupation, have fallen, and Egypt is the only one enduring after this not-so-cold Cold War. Either way, Egypt was not just a vast empire with virtually uninterrupted annual harvests. That 7-year period in Joseph did actually happen. We do know that there was a time period when there was about 7 years where the Nile failed. A couple of times that actually happened. So we don't know again when Joseph might have existed. We've got a couple of options. But almost never did the Nile fail consistently. It was a pretty guaranteed annual harvest. But no place else really in the Middle East did that happen. But she was a technological innovator. Until the rise of the early Iron Age, and she didn't have iron, so that's when she starts to follow behind Rome and the other places that had ready supplies of iron. She remained the major superpower in the area. She had copper and tin supplies coming from the Sinai or from farther south. So she had ready supplies to the major weapon-making tools. She had an unlimited supply of manpower to make her weapons, and she had developed both chariots and the yokes for the horses to draw them. She had a bow technology equal or better to either the Mongol bow or the English longbow, which were considered the best bows until we actually found Egyptian bows. So for most of her imperial history, Egypt had a state-of-the-art weapons technology, vast deserts to her east and to her west, and along most of her southern border, making her very hard to invade. Really, it only was Nubia that could do it successfully, and they came up the Nile. She exported food, imported manpower, outsourced some of her defense to hired mercenaries, and it was those Nubians that did it. Ruled a good chunk of the Mediterranean with her navy, and regularly sent out expeditions, and listen to this, she sent them out to India to bring in luxury goods. She was only successfully invaded 3 times, twice by Nubia to the south, and once by a group of people we don't even know who they are, but they invaded all of the Mediterranean at one time. And she usually kicked out those invaders within 100 years or so. And if they didn't leave, she assimilated them and they became Egyptian. So she really didn't need God. Her gods were reflections of her power. In the plagues, one by one, God tears them down, and one by one he warns the Egyptians that they are not as secure as they thought, but they refuse to listen. Living on the edge, the Hebrew people are slaves in this land of plenty. For the most parts, they were probably not working on building projects. That's an image we get from the movies and not from scripture. We have records for those building projects, and they were mostly built by free people. We have arguments in the records of them lobbying successfully for unions, among other things. The Egyptians weren't stupid. You don't give large numbers of slaves access to building tools. They can be turned into weapons. Most of the Hebrew slaves were probably working in cotton and flax and grain plantations, in the temples and in the royal household fields, where they brought in those things, or where they would have been working in pit mines in the Sinai. Someone else still owned their body, their work, and their children. The Hebrew people were a small, downtrodden people with no hope of victory against a superpower with unlimited resources. I know that the city says that they built 2 cities, but I think that we're getting the verb a little bit messed up there. These cities are specifically mentioned as storage cities. I think that, again, is a confusion on what that meant. That was probably more temple cities. They were controlled by the pharaoh and the priests. They were responsible for supplying the grain and the other supplies needed to keep the temple complex going. It would have been an even crueler life for these people who were dedicated to the God of the Bible to be forced to work in the service of other gods. Every forced act went to the service of gods they did not know. When Moses and Aaron begged for permission to worship their own God, they are seen to be asking to break with the temples that owned them, to be seen to ask for a defiance that the Pharaoh could not honor. And this is part of the reason he says no so consistently. It had to be relentlessly crushed. The people who believed in empire, the Egyptians here, are the ones who are doomed, God tells them. But if you, the Hebrew people in this story, will trust in me, I will pass over you. I will give you hope. What will be death to those who are confident that they can go it on their own will be life and freedom to you. And then he tells them to celebrate and remember this annually, not because it's good news that all those young people are killed, even if they were slave holders and masters, but because that same heart of empire lives in each one of us. Build a memorial, not in statues, but in living words and sacred actions. Pour the wine, break the bread, sacrifice the lamb, eat the bitter herbs, use the haroset. Tell the tale to your children and the immigrant living in the land among you. Because if you don't, you run the risk of building up the empire spirit in your own heart. And so on that first Passover, the people gathered and painted their doors with blood and waited for God to pass over. In the morning, they walk out into a new life, a free life. And the grief-stricken nation lets them go with gold and jewels, and they set their face to the rising sun. But the spirit of empire does live in each of us. It always tries to kill this God of freedom. And all the people who are killed are called by his name. It tries to replace this God with the God of self, with the God of money, with the God of self-sufficiency, or the God of supremacy, the God of inhumanity to others, with thousands and thousands of petty dictators that live in homes and in nations, And all of those gods shout, "I am God, you must worship me." And the spirit of empire always, always fails. The God of freedom, however, does not lie down and die. Or rather, our God does lie down and die, but refuses to stay dead. Every time this imperial spirit rises, so too does our God. Every time the slavery of hearts and minds and bodies threatens to choke out life, God again stands on the banks of the Nile and shouts, "Let my people go." In the long night of abuse, imprisonment, addiction, and lawlessness, God again passes over. The things that shackle us in the dark begin to shatter, and again we walk out into the light, singing a song of freedom. He enters into the Jordan and submits to baptism. He walks the long, hard path to Jerusalem. He kneels in the halls of power, takes the whip, while we shout, "Crucify," and nail him to a tree. Egypt was sure of herself. Her nameless king was sure and smug and knew who he was. Nobody could hurt him. He could say with no small